Everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of The Climate of Sport. Ask Me Anything with me, Claire Poole. It's my pleasure to be back with you, tackling another one of the questions that you've sent in for us to answer. And I would encourage you to keep sending those questions in. I've had a few social media messages and emails saying, are you still accepting questions? Yes, of course we are. Please do send those in if there are things that you want us to cover off. We've got a few plans for the next couple of weeks' episodes, but then after that, we're super happy to keep getting more questions in. So do keep them coming. This week on the pod, the question we're tackling came from Simon on email. How do we help athletes and sports stars who want to have a voice on climate feel empowered, brave, and enabled to do so? So this is a really big issue. Athletes are, of course, the voice of sport. They are the ones with the followers. They are the ones with the platform and profile and the humans sitting at the heart of excellence and performance in sport. So having athletes join us on the journey around sustainability in sport is absolutely brilliant and really, really important in terms of connecting with fans on these issues. So we're going to go through a few different things on this question, starting off really with what's stopping them. So how we help the athletes is the question. What's stopping them from talking out? Why do we have to help them? Time and again, we hear that being called a hypocrite is the biggest concern of athletes. And this week, I'd like to pass over to one of our experts early on, who is Emma Pocock, co-founder and CEO of Frontrunners. Frontrunners is a movement led by athletes for all Australians, calling serious climate action now. Let's hear from Emma, first of all, about what she hears from athletes.
We hear a lot from athletes about the things which stop them from speaking up on the issues they care about. It's things like feeling they don't know enough, worrying about the public backlash, worrying that they're not doing themselves enough to tackle the climate crisis, worrying that their team or their governing body might not look favourably on it, even things like worrying that it might seem like they're not focused enough on competing.
Fabulous to hear from Emma there to start us off, and really interesting feedback about what she's hearing from athletes. The one around the team or governing body not looking favourably and the fact that athletes are seen as not focused enough on competing are very interesting, I think, in terms of what's being heard. And famously, years ago, LeBron James spoke out, I think, around some elections, and US media commentator infamously said, shut up and dribble, which is obviously the way some people view athletes, as wanting to see them perform in a certain way, but somehow don't feel as though they're entitled to opinions, which is so wrong. Starting off with some reasons of what's actually stopping athletes speaking out. We know that if athletes, especially, are at the top of their game, their job usually involves a lot of travel. But then some of them, not the vast majority of athletes, but some, again, at the very elite level, will have a much larger dispensable income and therefore have lifestyles that maybe don't align with sustainability. I know from conversations with current professional athletes that they sometimes reference they don't have the headspace to take action in these areas in a big way. You know, they are so focused on training. In many cases, they may be raising funds themselves through sponsors or doing activations, again, trying to squeeze in any time they've got free away from training to obviously see family and friends. And it feels like too much to take on, even if they feel concern around these issues. And that's why we often see athletes nearing retirement or retired athletes speaking out, which is great. So when athletes do speak out on something they care about and it links to the environment, what we're used to seeing is the trope of how dare they care about the environment when they have a large carbon footprint. We need to redress that narrative. So first of all, I want to talk briefly about why we actually want athletes to speak out on this and what we're already seeing when it comes to it being a growing idea. So first of all, in terms of why we want athletes to speak out on this, Melissa Wilson, who's the co-founder of Athletes of the World and actually is another expert we'll hear from later, showed me information a couple of years ago that I've since shared multiple times, and we'll also add the link to on the podcast, from the MIT Pantheon, which basically shows athletes such as soccer players, basketball players, tennis players, cyclists, racing drivers, skiers, are the leading historical figure of our time from about 1950 onwards. What that means is people listen to them, obviously. Previous historical occupations that were leading are religious leaders, politicians, writers. In our generation, it's athletes. So that's why we want athletes to speak out on this issue, because they do have such a platform such reach and such influence. If we think about the power of the athlete voice in terms of influence, again, if you're querying what the benefits are there, just look at what athletes are paid in sponsorship deals or to use a particular product or service. Sometimes eye-wateringly amounts of money are paid to athletes to align with a brand. A brand wouldn't be doing that unless there's a huge upside. So I think we're all fairly agreed that the cult of celebrity, of which especially top flight athletes are part of, is huge. So that's why we want athletes to speak out on it. What we're already seeing when it comes to a growing idea is athletes speaking out and taking action in various ways. Some examples: Pat Cummins, the Australian cricket captain, started Cricket for Climate, which is about using his voice to raise awareness, as well as using his influence to enable, for example, solar panels to be put on grassroots cricket clubs within Australia. So using the voice to raise awareness, but also using his influence and connections to enable action as well. David Pocock, a former Wallabies rugby captain, has led many campaigns in this area, is now a senator. So again, has been an incredibly influential voice in this area, using his platform to drive real change. Most recently, Flora Duffy, who's a triathlete, added her personal carbon footprint across a whole season. And she shared that on social media, showing what her carbon footprint was across travel and equipment. And again, raising awareness of what that looks like for an individual, which is really interesting. At the Women's World Cup, we saw the 44 players led by Danish international Sophie Young Pedersen take action to compensate for their environmental impact of the flights of the tournament by donating money to climate resilience and offsetting initiatives. There's loads more examples that I could mention, but essentially we're seeing athletes at the highest level taking action in these areas in different ways. And in terms of it being a growing idea, we're also seeing a lot of athletes being supported in this area by organisations. So on this podcast today, we've already heard from Emma at Front Runners. We'll hear from Melissa Wilson at Athletes of the World and Etienne, Stott, who is for Champions for Earth. There are other organisations like Eco Athletes, led by Blaustein, Players for Planet, led by Chris Dickerson, High Impact Athletes, and more. So there's a lot of organisations out there that are working really hard to support athletes that do want to take action on this. And we hear more that agencies that represent professional athletes as well are starting to understand this more. So we've set a bit of the scene there about what we're seeing. So let's get on to the advice. If an athlete comes to you to ask for advice, or if there's any athletes listening here, this is, for me, how I would go about it. I think this is a methodical approach for thinking, if you're an athlete who wants to speak out, and the question was, we want them to feel empowered, brave, and enabled, how can we help them do that? So first of all, my advice number one is know where you are. Ask or encourage athletes to think about how this issue presents in their day-to-day life. Be honest. As an athlete, what issue do you really care about? Do you live it? Is it who you are? Or do you just think it's really important and you feel perhaps an obligation to be more active in these areas? There are no right and wrongs with these. This is just really about knowing who you are and knowing where you are with this. So be honest with yourself. Think about what your lifestyle looks like. You can't avoid some impacts of your job in terms of travel and equipment, etc. But how do you live the rest of your life? Think about ways that you perhaps do your part in these areas and how much you do it and how far it goes through your entire lifestyle. Think about who your sponsors are or the brands you work with. Do you try and align with ethical and sustainable organizations and those that align with some of your principles when you think about what you care about? Do you think any of your sponsors really don't align with your views that you might need to reconsider if you are going to begin speaking out on this issue? Lastly, think about what you really care about. So how this issue of climate, sustainability, nature, biodiversity, environmental justice, how does that present in your day-to-day life? So you may not have to speak out about the climate crisis in its entirety. Maybe you're vegan. Maybe you've invested in an ethical or sustainable company. Maybe you drive an electric vehicle. Maybe you're already working with your sports club or federation to drive bigger impact. So again, how is it authentically represented in your life? And I think that's good advice for us all, is to understand who we are and where we are before we start taking action. Number two, ask or encourage athletes to think about how comfortable they are to talk out about key issues or where their reservations might be. So they might be really passionate about the topic, but feel a little bit uninformed. Or they may wish to share something they're doing that they think people will be interested in and show a positive impact on the environment, but they want to go the extra mile to ensure it lands in the best way. If you are a sports organisation, a federation, an agent, a brand, a sponsor, if you are around athletes that are looking to activate in this way, think about how you could support with training and education, connecting them with experts in the space, and thinking and iterating on ideas of ways to deliver key messaging in a way that feels really authentic and transparent. Number 3, ask or encourage your athletes to think about what they may wish to speak out on or what they might like to react to in certain situations. Again, maybe you're not happy yet to begin to be really visible on this, but maybe you're happy to react to news or talk about the bigger picture stuff. So examples of this, athletes that are interviewed about their own activations or efforts. So for example, Hannah Mills on the Big Plastic Pledge, Hector Bellerin on investing in Forest Green Rovers, Matthew Flamini on his biochemicals company, Chris Smalling on investing ethically. Some athletes are more visible about this in a way that it's a campaign they're leading, it's a way they're acting or taking action. And they're not necessarily saying, this is what everyone should do, but they're saying, this is what I'm doing, which is quite interesting. And the athlete may not wish to be vocal about themselves as an individual, but maybe they're happy to get behind a project that their sport is leading, to be an ambassador or a voice of support for activities that are happening. So say, for example, organizations are launching a sustainability strategy. Maybe there's certain players within the industry who are happy to lend their voice to a forward for the sustainability strategy, saying, I applaud the work that's happening in this area. So again, it's just a different way to intersect with the topic. Number 4, ask or encourage athletes to think about where they might like to speak out on this and in what ways. So, for example, they may feel much more comfortable to surface some of these thoughts on their own social media channels, to be in charge of the narrative, and it feels like it's coming directly from them. Or they may prefer to collaborate with their club or their team or their governing body or their federation around work that's already happening or get involved with existing projects. Interesting to ask and understand where it feels comfortable to do so, but also depending on perhaps education, training, understanding, that might change, but interesting to understand where they think they may wish to speak out on certain issues and in what ways. And then the last point, I would say, number 5, is be realistic. You are not going to please all the people all the time. The internet can often feel very loud and people will always have an opinion. And I think we live in a strange time where every single individual has a microphone to the world. Trolls and bots exist online to fuel discontent. We're all hypocrites to an extent. You cannot exist in the world we live in today, which has been built on fossil fuels, and not be hypocritical in some ways. So how can we think about almost reducing the likelihood of being called a hypocrite, but understanding as well that being called a hypocrite, if you feel comfortable that you are doing a lot and it feels very authentic, that actually isn't the worst thing in the world either. The French philosopher Voltaire said the perfect's the enemy of the good, and we talk about this a lot in terms of being on a journey in sport and sustainability. But I think if we think about, first of all, who is calling you out as a hypocrite, if that happens, and honestly, my question there to athletes is, does their opinion matter to you? And that's genuine, that's not hyperbole. If someone you respect the opinion of calls you a hypocrite, then let's have a think about what we're doing. If it's Jiminy Bob 7992794 with 3 followers on Twitter calling you out for it, that's probably not something you need to be overly concerned with. And most rational people understand that perfection doesn't exist. You can be a vegan who drives a diesel car. You can not own a car, but then fly for work. You could never purchase new clothes and exist entirely in the circular economy of charity shops and repairing, but eat meat. Perfection doesn't exist. But I think what's important about this is being on the front foot about why you might be called out for speaking out on the topic and having an idea about what your response might be. The majority of athletes face being called a hypocrite because of how much they have to travel for work in terms of competitions. But also there is a helpful reframing of that is your job. You have to travel for work just like business people do. But unfortunately with sport, it's a much more visible way. You can't change that, but there are areas in your life that you can influence. So just thinking, how can I reduce that as far as possible? Perhaps how you're working with your federation and what the federation is doing to change competition calendars to try and reduce that travel, but acknowledging that within our existing society in a globalized world, travel is part of that. And, there's only a limited amount you can impact in that area, but these are the things that you are doing, for example. So how could we think about reducing the chance of being called out for hypocrisy, and how we might start to think around this area? So again, I think one of the biggest things with this is when it comes to athletes, first of all, in many cases, you don't actually need to be instructive. We can see with influencer culture that people will emulate what celebrities and people that they look up to do, as well as what they say. So actually, even just sharing your own journey with this on how you're trying to improve what you're doing, ask others if you're doing the same. So flip the script a little bit from feeling as though you have to take a stand and get behind a campaign, and just have more of a conversation and dialogue with your followers or your fans around what you're doing. You could even throw something out of like, I'm already doing all of these things. I have to travel for my job, but my pension's in a green fund. I drive an electric vehicle. My energy tariff's renewable. I've reduced my meat intake. But what else can I do to try and have a positive impact on the environment? Things like that of starting a conversation can be really helpful. Being transparent, sharing progress, etc. in this area. There's some ways that you can think about having these conversations with athletes, how sports stars who want to have a voice on climate can help to feel empowered, brave, and enabled to do so. I'm sure you've got loads of ideas as well, and we'd love to hear from you about what they are. We're going to hear now from a few of our experts who we asked to come back to us on their thoughts with this. So let's pass back to Emma Pocock for her thoughts on how athletes can take action and how we can actually support them to do so.
But we know that they care. So I guess the question is, how do we remove some of these barriers? And I think, and I think we can see in the work that we've done with frontrunners, that it's about equipping them with the tools to feel confident. Now, that might be a bit of education. It might be making sure when they do speak out, there are plenty of fans and other athletes ready to swing in behind them and support them. It might be working with their club or their governing body to make sure they understand the connection between sport and climate and the value in athletes speaking up. Or it might be something like working with athletes to help them actually take practical climate action. So when they do speak up on these issues, they don't feel like hypocrites. There are a whole range of things we can do to ensure that their really important voices do get to be heard on these issues.
Great to hear the rest of Emma's thoughts there. Equipping them with tools, education, working with the clubs and governing bodies is great. Working with athletes to take practical climate action themselves, like all such great advice in terms of how athletes can begin to take action. I'm going to pass now to Melissa Wilson, who's co-founder of Athletes of the World, who's got some really interesting insights on this as well. So, Melissa, let us know what you think.
In terms of supporting athletes, I think we've tended to focus on a couple of things with Athletes of the World. One has been making sure that athletes have enough background information that they can feel confident and credible as spokespeople on different issues. Lots of us working in sport and sustainability will feel ourselves like, even if we're working full-time in this space, there's not enough time to feel fully on top of all the different issues at play. And I think that can be even more the case with athletes who have to juggle their training as well as what we're hoping to involve them in. So being sensitive to that, and especially when we're asking them to be spokespeople for these issues, few of us would want to get up on any sort of platform to be discussing an issue that we don't feel that we're fully on top of. So having information that's readily accessible, that's in formats that athletes can access, regardless of when their training is, in a format that works for them, I think is really valuable. I also think that what a lot of organisations in the space increasingly doing, which is great, is looking to create communities for athletes, so that there's a sense of camaraderie, and you're not just leaving athletes feeling like they want to speak about this issue, but they're going to be alone in doing so. I think we know increasingly that climate is an issue that the majority of people, a significant majority of citizens in most countries, are concerned about. I think when any of us, athletes included, know that we can speak about something alongside other voices, it really helps. So drawing on that, I think, is really key. Making sure where possible that the athlete is correctly supported by their sports governing body or their federation, so they have a sense of what that organisation or event is undertaking in this space, not necessarily so that they can go overboard representing that. That might be part of the focus for an organisation, but I think simply to bolster the athlete with confidence that they're able to speak from a platform of a sport that is engaged in this space, I also think is really valuable. So those would be some of my reflections on how we leave athletes feeling empowered and enabled, which is such an important area for us to be discussing. And just a final observation that I do think is key. It's powerful for organisations and events to be seeking to enable athletes through information and developing communities. But I think what we also can't leave out of the picture is the role of the media. And if we're wanting athletes to be able to speak about these issues in a way that carries, making sure that the athletes receive media training, but also that the media that they engage with, where possible, is reasonably briefed so that athletes aren't made to feel that they need to be climate experts in this space, but can speak as the impressive individuals they are with the experience they have either of direct climate impacts or impacts on their communities or particular areas of concern for them. But I think it is important that there's a nuanced approach taken by the media so that athletes aren't treated as climate scientists. And so where possible, if those involved in seeking to support athletes can take that into account, I think that can often make a difference as well.
Melissa mentioning education as well there, which we understand, I'm sure, across all of our experts, and the information I've shared is a big element of this. But really interesting as well from Melissa around the community and camaraderie, not feeling as though you're alone with this, I think is a really helpful nugget to take from Melissa's advice there, as well as some of the other areas she's mentioned and the media side as well. Lastly, let's hear from Etienne Stott, who's co-founder of Champions for the Earth and Olympic gold medalist himself.
I think supporting athletes and sports stars who want to raise their voices in this climate and ecological emergency, the key is preparation. And that isn't such a wild idea for many athletes who are used to preparing for things, for challenges. First things first, I think they need to be prepared and they can be supported to have authentic responses to common criticisms. The most obvious and common is this accusation of hypocrisy. And of course, everyone is a hypocrite. Everyone is involved in this system at different levels, and everyone can be accused of hypocrisy. So learning and having a coherent and authentic way of seeing that off, or at least dealing with it and moving on to the issue, is really important. Then, of course, a solid grasp of the basic science and a way of handling like super sciencey criticisms about this technology, or this number of tons of CO2 to keep, again, on track with the conversation. I think that's really important. So a basic way of dealing with science questions and just having a grounding of science and being able to move on from that. I think also it is really key to understand that responding to the climate and nature emergency is a political struggle. It is about power and how it is or isn't being used. It doesn't mean you have to get down into party politics, but you do have to recognize that this isn't just about individual changes, and this is about kind of system level change, and that requires the use of power. Therefore, it is a political thing. This does kind of worry and scare people. But it is also quite empowering because it reduces the pressure on the individual and gives us something to aim for, something to talk about, a vision, a beautiful vision of something else that is possible. I think also it's really important to give athletes who are speaking out extra support, mental health support, to deal with the realization of the times that they are living in. And helping, and often probably feeling isolated within their communities, and even isolated more broadly. It can be quite lonely speaking out on these things. I think that's really important. And it may even be necessary to have financial support to help athletes who, for example, don't want to fly and who want to use overland or travel or something like this, which is obviously, well, most likely going to be more expensive. Is there a way that we can support them to make those choices that are really more more in line with that person's beliefs and understandings. But really, for me, the absolute root of this is that there is a mismatch between what sport is doing right now, how it's conducting itself, and what sport needs to do. And that's what makes the life of an athlete who's concerned about this so complicated and so much turmoil, so much stress and pressure. We need to get rid of the root of the conflict, and that really means making sport more sustainable. So the most powerful thing that could be done to support these athletes who are speaking out is to change sport, to genuinely be more sustainable in its practice. These thorny, challenging areas of travel, diet, and equipment in particular, these things make an athlete who is concerned about these matters very uncomfortable, because they are having to participate in these areas when they want to just play their sport and do their sport and compete, but actually it's really difficult to do that in a low impact way. Also, being associated with horrendous fossil fuel brands or high carbon brands also makes it really difficult. So again, this is something that sports governing bodies and managers and leaders need to address, because that again is probably one of the root causes of the discomfort. So much of the turmoil and the reasons for the need for the support for these athletes could be addressed by sport really taking this seriously and genuinely changing. So I'm not suggesting that's easy. I'm not suggesting that is a simple matter, but that is what is absolutely necessary right now. And if we're going to support those athletes who are speaking out, the most sensible thing to do is to try and reshape sports towards the healthy and sustainable future and away from the damaging future that we're currently headed towards.
More of the same in terms of the preparation in this case that Etienne mentions, which sort of falls in line with the education. Also, I think really, really interesting points there around the political struggle that Etienne mentions. The mental health support, a really, really important one. And again, tying in with what Melissa was saying about camaraderie, Etienne mentioning the isolation within communities. So again, that idea of connections, which is really important. Taking action. So again, beyond just educating athletes, actually stepping up with financial support, a really interesting one for organisations to consider. And this much bigger concept that Etienne mentions of part of the issues and part of the root of the hypocrisy being around a mismatch of what sport is doing and the need to reshape sport, which I think we've spoken about across many podcasts and in many conversations of the transformation in sport globally and what that would look like. So incredible to hear from such great experts. And as a reminder, Melissa Wilson is co-founder at Athletes of the World. Etienne Stott is co-founder of Champions for Earth, and Emma Pocock is founder and CEO of Front Runners. Check out all of those organisations, as well as Eco Athletes, Players for the Planet, High Impact Athletes, and others. The organisations are already there to help athletes take action. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. The support is there, and you can help athletes by directing them to these organisations. Are you an athlete yourself? Do you work with athletes? I hope you found this helpful in terms of the question that was answered today. Thanks again to Simon on email who sent in the question, how do we help sports stars and athletes who want to have a voice on climate feel empowered, brave and enabled to do so? My advice is know where you are, understand how comfortable you are to think about key issues or where reservations might be. Think about what you might like to speak out on or how you might like to react. Think about where you might like to speak out on issues and in what ways, and be realistic about the fact that you can't please all people all the time. I think with those ideas, as well as some of the incredible insights from our expert around education, community, camaraderie, support from governing bodies and organisations, helping athletes take practical action, supporting them financially and also on the mental health side. There's so much rich content there that hopefully is helpful for you all. I hope you've enjoyed the podcast this week. We look forward to seeing you next week. And as always, keep your questions coming in. We love to hear from you. As a reminder, it's hello@climateofsport.com. See you next time. Thanks for listening to the Climate of Sport podcast. Please like and subscribe and get in touch if you want to share information about the work that you're doing, if you want to appear as a guest or you want to recommend guests, or you just have ideas of conversations you'd like us to have. You can get in touch by emailing info@sport.com
sportpositivesummit.com.